LHBS. Uncomfortable Talks.
I'm going to start by telling you about what I'm not going to talk about, which is process. Okay, so I think there's too many processes already in the world. We don't need another process in the world. So what I'm going to talk to you about is not about promoting a new process, but as John Jay says, there is no singular process. But I'm going to talk to you instead about perhaps a guiding philosophy would be a good way of putting it. And I think the reason why I feel so passionate about this is because I think we're facing a bit of a perfect storm right now of a number of converging trends that are facing brands, which means they just have to think and act and work in a different way with their customers. So IBM do a survey about every 3 or 4 years or so, where they interview a lot of CEOs around the world, global CEOs, over 1,000 of them, 45 different countries, 32 different industries. So it's a pretty comprehensive survey, yeah, for very senior people around the world. It's called the Enterprise of the Future, right? The last one that they did found that the CEOs were saying that they felt their organisations were bombarded with change. Yeah, so language there, and they were struggling to keep up. So 80% of them saw significant change ahead, but more importantly, the gap between the expected level of change and the ability of their companies to manage it and deal with that change had widened since 2006. So in other words, it's pretty serious that so many people in such a senior position are saying that they don't feel their companies can cope with the amount of change that they already face, and it's getting worse. Yeah, so just think about what that is actually saying. So accelerating change is with us, it's reality. And part of the reason for that is because, of course, digital and the internet is disruptive. Yeah, in its nature, it disintermediates and it disrupts market. It changes the value flow within markets, which is a good definition, I think, of what disruption is all about. And it's relentless digitisation, not only of products and services, but also communications as well. So we're kind of on this journey, which has been talked about a lot for the last 3 or 4 years, in communications, away from one type of working towards another. Yeah, so, but I don't think we know where we're going yet, but I think we certainly know where we're moving away from. So I think it's up for debate about what we need to, where we're moving towards. But I think this year was a bit of a benchmark, a bit of a kind of flag in the sand, as it were, because it was interesting that that Cannes, which has just happened, for a start, the interesting thing was that it was renamed into a festival of creativity. So they broadened it out deliberately away from just pure advertising, even though most of what was talked about and presented at the festival is still advertising. But Mel wrote an interesting article for Fast Company about it, Mel at BDH. And she was talking about that this year really felt like the kind of year where advertising and technology had really got it together. So, and a personal observation about that was that the Cyberlines finalists, if you look down the list of all these shortlisted finalists, there were a significant proportion that were quite far removed from what you might call traditional advertising. So there were more experiences, what I would call experiences, rather than messaging or types of traditional advertising, which I think is a really interesting place for us to be right now. So, going back to all this kind of the trends, the perfect storm of trends that we're seeing right now. So this is Faris Yakov, of course. He talks about how this disintermediation of the internet. Yeah. So mass media previously aggregated lots of attention, and brands came along and bought that attention, and now it's much more about earning. Yeah. So the concept of earned media. So this is now embedded in the lot of strategy decks presented by media agencies, I think, every single week. But it's true that it's much more about the content that you produce and earning attention, so the things that you do that people elect to spend time with. Yeah? And there's a lot of competition out there for people's time. So we're moving away from this kind of broadcast mentality, so advantage doesn't necessarily come so much from scale anymore. Perhaps it comes from responsiveness instead. Big isn't necessarily always better. I like the quote here from Mediatel, which talks about how he sees his role as helping brands to remember what it's like when you're small. Yeah? So there's real value, I think, in that kind of relationship with your customers. So one of my favourite pictures of all time. But the role of media is really changing. It used to be lovely and simple, where you produce content, you get attention in return. Now you have these things called tools and applications and services. So in return, it's much more complex. You get not only attention, but participation, interaction, the content that your users produce as well. So it's a fundamental shift in the value equation of how media works. Clay Shirky talks a lot about this. So if you haven't read Here Comes Everybody, I always recommend it. It's the best book, I think, talking about the shift in how media works and what that means for people. But he talks about this role of media as a facilitator, shifting away from kind of one-way messaging and more towards creating an environment for convening and supporting groups. Yeah, so that's what media is really good at now. How about this for a kind of subversion of the way we've thought for a long time? So Zuckerberg, one of my favourite Zuckerberg quotes, talks about how everybody else thinks that the purpose of communication is to get information, whereas they think that the purpose of information is to foster communication. Yes, it's a real kind of turning the fundamentals of what media does on its head. So I think that's a challenge for companies, but I also think it's a massive opportunity in this networked world where everybody's connected, for brands and client companies to work with their customers in a different way. Yeah, so we're talking about some of these things down here which are overused words already, but I think it stretches further than that. I think it goes into the way in which companies work themselves, not just in communications. But there's challenges. Yeah? So we're not short of challenges in getting that achieved, not least of which is the explosion in the amount of data which companies have to cope with. So Marissa Mayer says that this explosion of data is bigger than Moore's law. Remember, Moore's law is the law that says every 18 months computing capacity or processing capacity doubles. Yeah? So it's rapidly increasing, but the amount of data is increasing quicker than that. I mean, look at that quote there from Eric Schmidt down the bottom. That's just a real kind of amazing thing that he's saying about the amount of data which is just around now, which companies have to deal with. It's driven by real-time data, social media, mobile is data-rich, but also the Internet of Things, objects communicating, streaming data out onto the Internet. So this is only going to get bigger and more challenging as we go forwards. Real-time, very real trend now. So the idea of cultural latency, to paraphrase Faris again, cultural latency reducing dramatically. So there's a correlation between the amount of time it takes to information to be transmitted, to have an effect, and the corresponding cultural decay rate. So in other words, things happen very quickly, go up very quickly, and tail off very quickly. Yeah, it used to be a nice kind of easily manageable curve, and now it just gets very big very, very quickly. So content creation is very easy, very cheap to produce, so cultural latency reducing. Reason for that, not least of which, is the social networks. Everybody's connected to everybody else. 95% of likes happen within the first day, within 22 hours. So things get spread very, very quickly. Same with Twitter. So with Twitter, 71% of tweets get no reaction at all, 23% are conversations, 6% get retweets, so passing content on. Of those 6%, 92% of retweets happen in the first hour. So if you want something to spread, if you want content to spread, it's got to happen in an hour. If it hasn't, it's gone. Yeah? And that's because it's a stream that you're talking about, a stream of content. It's not a static thing anymore. So, and I think you're seeing a lot now of where new applications are coming along which are parasitic to existing networks and parasitic to existing applications. They ride off the back of your Twitter connections, for example. Make it very easy for people to sign up to services very quickly, connect with the same people or different people. So here you have kind of lots of different services, and over time people are starting to use more and more of these services. So ideas spread quickly because people are on multiple services which are interconnected with each other. So the idea of APIs connecting lots of different services together. So did anybody see this? This is a fascinating case study. So I use it as an example of the kind of world in which we're in now. So this is a children's. It's not a children's book, but it's a parody of a children's book. Yeah, it's an adult book. But this was Adam Mansbach down here. So he's got a 2-year-old daughter. Was trying to get his 2-year-old daughter to sleep, failing miserably. So he updated his Facebook status, saying, "Look out for my forthcoming children's book. Go the F to sleep." I'm not going to swear because I'm on video. Otherwise I would. But go the F to sleep, okay? So, and that got loads of really good reaction from his friends. They were saying, that's a brilliant idea, you should do it, brilliant, fantastic. So he thought, oh, maybe there's something in that. So you know what, that's a bottom-up idea. That's not a top-down idea, that's a bottom-up idea. So sure enough, he wrote the book, and he got a publisher who really liked the idea. And you know what, it's hit #1 on the Amazon bestseller list 1 month before the book has even come out. How does that work? The reason is because it's pirated. Yeah, it was pirated on a PDF version. So it becomes a very spreadable piece of media, spreadable piece of content, a social object, whatever you like. So people talk about these things, but it's just people passing it on, this pirated version. So actually piracy was helping something to get to the top of the bestseller list on Amazon. You know, go figure that one out. So that's the kind of work, that's the kind of world that we are operating in which brands have got to deal with now. Okay, so let's talk about Agile Planning, all right? So bearing in mind that perfect storm of challenges and trends that we're facing, I think that Agile Planning is just one of the things that we should think about. Yeah? So to me, this is about challenging the way in which we do stuff. Yeah? A lot of people talk about social media and the platforms, about Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and so on. And for me, making real change is about behavioural change, you know, what people do. So Agile Planning for me is much more about how you look at something and about what you then do. So I'm going to talk about not a process, but a guiding philosophy or a set of guiding principles. Yeah? So I've got 7 things that I want to talk about as part of this, yeah, which are just kind of loosely brought together in my mind somehow. Okay, so a bit of context to begin with, yes? So this word agile, already a bit of an overused word, certainly by me, but I think, you know, for good reason, because it's a word that means something in the digital space, for good reason. So back in 2001, a bunch of software developers got together and were thinking there's got to be a better way of producing software, you know, creating websites. So they created this thing called the Agile Manifesto, which was a kind of statement of intent to say this is how we think efficient working should operate within software development. So broadly speaking, and I've changed some of the phrase, but they're broadly speaking the same, so it's a bit of a redux this one, but individuals and interactions, so the importance of the individual and interactions between individuals over processes and tools. So people often focus on processes and tools and the importance of that. This is saying that individuals and interactions are more important. Okay? So all of these things, there is still value in these things over here, but these things are more valuable. That's what they're saying. Yeah? So we're not saying one is replacing the other here, we're saying they're more valuable. Working outputs over comprehensive inputs. So again, companies often focus on really extensive documentation, lengthy detailed plans. You know, it's all about the input. If you put in a good input, then you're going to get a good output. Are you? Collaboration over contracts and hierarchy. So again, a lot of times in which the way in which companies often work is they tie stuff up in contracts because they feel secure and comfortable in a contractual arrangement. Hierarchy kind of works in that situation. Responding to change over following a plan. Yeah, so those are the kind of key principles. So this is the kind of context or the framing by which I'm going to talk about these 7 principles. So my first one is ideas from anywhere. Okay, so Stephen Johnson wrote this this very good book. It's been out a few months now, I think, called Where Good Ideas Come From. Okay, and in that book he talks about the Eureka myth. Okay, so the idea that the myth of the lone creative genius, the kind of guy who has the light bulb going off over his head and saying, yes, that's a brilliant idea, fantastic. A lot of people think that's how great ideas happen, how breakthroughs happen within organisations. And he says that actually ideas take a long time to mature. They're often, they lie dormant around businesses in the form of hunches or half ideas. And I can recognise that, actually, I don't know whether you can, but you know, you just kind of feel that something could be done in a better way. You have a sort of an idea, but you're not really sure what that looks like, but it's a half idea. Yeah, it's the collision of those half ideas within businesses that enable breakthroughs to happen. So therefore, if that's true, then the great driver of innovation is the increase in connectivity between people, within organisations and generally the increase in connectivity. So agile enterprises is my phrase, but agile enterprises that really get that create physical and virtual spaces where these ideas can mingle, these half ideas, to enable those kind of breakthroughs to happen. So the great example of that was coffee houses in the Enlightenment, where lots of discussion was had around issues. So this brings us to the idea of what you might call porous enterprise. So the idea of companies that recognise the value in employees who are connected to the interesting things out there, and employees who increasingly recognise the value of being connected to the interesting things that are happening in their own industry, because they can bring new thinking into the organisation. So non-core thinking. So this book here, called The Power of Pull, this is an interesting one. It's written by 3 directors for the Deloitte Centre for the Edge in the US. But they talk about this idea of porous enterprise. So they talk about these connected employees which are on the edges of organisations, connected into the interesting ideas, pulling in new thinking, so non-core thinking. So in the centre of an organisation, you might have the kind of business as usual, but doing things slightly more efficiently than you were doing before. Outside of that, you have this new thinking which flows into an organisation. The flow of ideas is more important than the stocks of knowledge that sits within an organisation. So McKinsey did a piece of research around this idea of networked enterprises, quite recent, and they talked about this class of company now, which they called the fully networked enterprise. So the idea is that businesses which use Web 2.0, for want of a better phrase, extensively within their business to connect the people up within their business, but also externally to the interesting people and ideas outside their business. And they did a big survey. They talked to a lot of companies about this and assessed their level of connectivity. And they found that companies that were fully networked in this way were more likely to be market leaders, more likely to be gaining market share, or more likely to be using management practices that would lead to higher margins. So there is money attached to working in this way. So that, to me, means no silos. So particularly big organisations are very good at doing silos. But I think it's interesting. You take creativity as an example. I think we're very good at compartmentalising creativity. So as soon as when we think of individual creativity, we think of that kind of lone genius or people coming up with great ideas. When we think of organisational creativity, so creativity at a company level, we start to try and put rules around it. We start to try and control it. We start to say, okay, we've got a creative department over here, or we have somebody with a job title that has got the word creative in it. It's their job to be creative, nobody else's. Or, worse than that, we box it into brainstorming sessions. We say, this is the time of day when we are going to be creative. So you've got to come up with your idea in that hour, otherwise we're not going to do it. So I think the John Jay quote down there about what he talked about in the film about the silo culture, I think is just as applicable to how we treat creativity. So let's look at a couple of cultures which I think are really interesting and very agile in their approach to this issue. So Pixar. Pixar is a fascinating business. There's a great talk online by Ed Catmull, who's the president of Pixar. About a half an hour talk. It's just revelatory when he talks about how they work as an organisation. So you think about the complexity of the projects that they've got to work on, the creative projects. Some of those films that they're producing, hugely complex projects, but they do it by involving a creative process that involves a large number of people, often from lots of different disciplines who all bring different things to it. They put them together as a team to work together. So I love this quote down here. So the idea of it's a flaw to kind of think that you can do this through one person or a singular thing. It's inevitably going to be lots of people that can add value to a process like that. And the idea of creative leadership is really interesting. So the kind of Pixar version of creative leadership is that if somebody goes, so their version of leadership, if somebody goes over there, you're a leader if people follow. So it's not about being told what to do, it's about people wanting to follow you, which I think is a really interesting view of creativity. And let's look at the other end of that. So we've Mel's quote earlier on talking about the marriage of creativity and technology, which is the interesting place we're in right now. So let's take a technological example, Facebook. Okay, you look at the way that Facebook work. There was a post I read from a Facebook employee about 6 months ago, which was fascinating, talking about the way in which their engineering culture works. Yeah, so it's kind of interesting that the engineers are at the centre of their culture. Resourcing for projects is completely voluntary. Yeah, so they don't say, right, we're going to do this. Here's our strategy. We're going to deliver this product, and we want these 3 engineers to help deliver that project. Instead, the project leaders have to pitch to the developers to generate interest, to get them to want to work on their project. Yeah? So think about that. It's a complete subversion of the way in which most cultures and organisations work. That's non-hierarchical, but it's the engineers are the ones that decide on what they want to work on. So, my 18 visual. So it's interesting that agile development is often centred around this kind of belief that the best results come from self-organising teams, and self-organising teams are very powerful because, think about that, if you have volunteers for something, you're going to be a lot more engaged with it, you're going to be a lot more motivated with it because you've volunteered for it, you're passionate about that already, so you're going to work a lot harder for it. So, so my question is, and my challenge is, what if we operated like that in the world of communications? Why don't we work like that? Because that seems to me like an interesting way of working. So, and a couple of kind of add-ons to that. I think it's interesting some of the things that some agencies are doing to try and think culturally in a different way. So, Whedon's just launched the Portland Incubator Experiment. It's been going for a couple of years now. But they've just brought in some of their key clients. So Coke, I think, and Target are part of this now. And so this is all about incubating startup businesses and startup enterprises. The startups get access to seed funding, office space, and mentors and help from Whedon's, of course. But you know, what Whedon's get in return is access to some of that culture, that pixie dust that startups have, which I think is a really smart thing to do, actually, just to kind of soak up some of that way of working. So now we're starting to move into this, thinking about different ways of working and thinking about talent networks, the rise of talent networks. So I think we're in a bit of a perfect storm, another one, where we've got lots of highly talented individuals that have come onto the market because of the economy, the economic state, and they are equipped with the ready means to make a difference, i.e. they've got a laptop with a Wi-Fi connection. And at the same time, the need for organisations to be a lot more flexible with their overheads and the way in which they work. And so the opportunity, therefore, is for organisations to work in a completely different way. Yeah, so not to have full-time employees, or so many full-time employees, but to outsource in a lot more viable way and to create networks of associates. So this is, I think, starting to happen. I'm certainly a part of a few of them myself. This brings us to an interesting startup agency in New York. 4 really talented individuals from Wolf Olins, JWT, some big names in advertising, just started up this studio. They call it a brand studio. So the idea behind this is it's like a movie studio. Yeah, they pull people in as necessary. They work with a big roster of specialist people and specialist agencies who do particular things really, really well. Yeah, and they do it because they specialise in that thing. They're very good at it. So these people curate that, and they pull these people to work in on projects as and when needed. When that project is completed, they're dispersed. Yeah, they're not needed anymore. So it's like a film. Yeah, so it's like they're the director putting in the talent to work on the film. You produce a creative project, and then you disperse the talent. Yeah, that kind of makes sense to me. So I think that's an interesting model, an interesting way of working. So that to me is quite an agile approach. Okay, that's my number 1. Number 2, users at the centre. Okay, so users, really, really important. Amazon, okay, so an interesting approach, I think. Jeff Bezos, if you hear him talk about their approach, I think an approach to innovation, everything is led from the consumer. So he talks about how there's 2 ways to get bigger as a company. One is to look at what you're really, really good at and expand that out and use that. And the other way is to work backwards from the customer. And I like that phrase. I like working backwards from the customer. That's good. So you isolate what the customer need is, you work backwards, and even if that means that you have to get new skills, it's stuff that you weren't doing before, you do it because that's the customer need. So that's where the Kindle came from. Yeah, the Amazon were not a hardware producer. but the Kindle originated from working back from the customer, fulfilling a customer need. And look where it's gone. So, I mentioned at the start, I curate a series of events for Google in the UK called Firestarters. So this is the last one that we did. We had Tom Hume, who's the design director at IDEO, and he talked about design thinking. So the subject was design thinking and planning. I think there's lots of common ground between agile thinking and design thinking. Yeah? So not least of which is this idea of keeping being relentlessly customer focused and keeping the user at the centre. Yeah, so he talked a lot about the value of observation within context, so not out of context. So the thing about focus groups is that if you're observing behaviour, often that behaviour is out of context. Yeah, so there's more value arguably in observing behaviour within context or actually experiencing it yourself. That's what they do a lot of the time. Yeah, so maybe there's some interesting things that advertising could learn from user experience. Yeah, because that's what and all that is about. And he also talked about challenging the question. Yeah, so the Instagram founders did a talk which you can probably get to online. It's on my blog. But they talked about finding the right problem to solve. Yeah, and then I liked this quote from Dan Greenberg, who founded ShareThrough, who talks about marry the problem, not the solution. So I think a lot of the time what happens is that companies get married to the solution. Yeah, they create a really good solution to something, and then they stick with it through thick and thin. So even if it's not really relevant anymore, even if there's a slightly better one, they still stick with that because it's that's our solution. Yeah. But if you marry the problem, then you're going to be constantly iterating your solution to that problem. So that's a nice approach. My number 3 is not a single solution, but lots of choices. Yeah. So this is an interesting one. So we're going to talk about path dependence. Okay, this is what psychologists, psychological phrase. Path dependence is all about how the decisions that you face and the decisions that you make are limited by the decisions that you've made in the past. So in other words, you use the information that you've had access to in the past and decisions you made in the past to inform the decisions you make in the future. Okay, so there's a lot to say that that's quite a good thing to do, but there's also a lot to say that sometimes you want to be a bit different. Yeah. So what we're talking about here is the idea of abductive thinking. So A.G. Lafley, who was the CEO of Procter & Gamble for many years, he took Procter & Gamble into the kind of FMCG behemoth that it is now. He, in this book, The Game Changer, talks about abductive thinking. So business schools and the way in which businesses operate focus on both inductive thinking, which is based on directly observable facts, and deductive thinking, so based on logic and analysis. Yeah, so nothing wrong with that. A lot of businesses and good business decisions are based on that. But what about abductive thinking, which I think is sorely absent from a lot of businesses? So thinking what is possible. That's what designers do. Designers think in abductive thinking. So what I'm talking about here is this idea of the difference between divergent thinking and convergent thinking. So again, I'm borrowing here from Tom Hume, from IDEO, but they talk a lot about this. So often, within businesses, it's all about convergent thinking. That's what's really important. Yeah, it's about making choices, recognition, reward, incentives are all about convergent thinking, narrowing down options, narrowing down choices until you arrive at the one solution, which is the right thing to do. Whereas instead, divergent thinking is about creating as many choices and options as possible. So my challenge, my question is, what if? What if instead of generating one solution to one problem, so one response to a brief, what if our job was different? What about if our job was about creating as many choices or options for clients as possible? So in other words, it's about creating and curating choice on behalf of our clients. That, I think, is an interesting place to be. Number 4 is test and learn. Yes, this is a truly agile kind of approach. So we're talking about the doing stuff now. So Eric Ries, you may have heard his name, but he has this thing called the lean startup movement. Yeah, so he's talked about, which is basically about lean, which is similar to agile but slightly different. But he talks about how the need to be lean or the need to be agile is not a factor of being a small company or a startup. It's a factor of the situation that most companies find themselves in. So his definition of a startup is an institution which is asked to create something under new conditions of high uncertainty. I'd say that was most businesses today. wouldn't you? So that to me says that companies need to be lean, and he talks about this combination of agile development software, methodologies rather, open source software, ferocious customer-centric iteration. Iteration, yes, good word. So that's lean startup. So now we come to the idea of kind of agile working practices. So tech teams often work in this way. So it's all about adaptability. So advantage doesn't comes less from scale and more from how quick and responsive you are to adapt to changing conditions and changing needs of your customers. So agile processes are really quite central to the way in which digital content is produced and digital websites are created and software and so on. So a lot of talk about failure, and failure is a big part of agile. And failure's been talked about for about 5-6 years, and Whedon and Kennedy make a thing about embracing failure. But the point I would make is that failure is useless unless you learn from failure. So that's what agile is all about: is failing fast but learning from your failures. Yeah. So I'm borrowing here from RGA, Razorfish. This is their kind of visualization, but this is the traditional waterfall method. Okay, so this is how tech teams worked for years, and how digital software was produced for many years. You come up with your concept, spend a lot of time designing your concept, and then you spend a lot of time designing that to the nth degree of detail. You know exactly what you're going to do, and then you spend time building it. Yeah? So it might be, if you're producing a website, say, that this whole process takes 6 months to produce. You come out, the first time you ship it is at the end here, yeah? And by shipping it, I mean that's the first time that the customer, the end user, sees it. So 6 months, so that's interesting. So a lot can happen in 6 months. So you might find that you get your concept, you design it in great detail, you build it, you ship it, and find it's irrelevant, yeah? Because the market's moved on, your competitive situation has changed, and your customer needs have changed, and that happens a lot, I think. So the idea behind agile processes is you still have your very strong concept at the start, you know exactly where you're going, you have a vision for where you want to go, but you iterate to get there. So you start off designing and building the bit that is going to give you the 80% of the value to what your proposition is. So often that's the core functionality of a site, yeah? And then you ship it, you put it live. So Google Labs, Google do this all the time. So just about every kind of new service that you see, like Google Plus and so on, they're all kind of in beta. So they ship them out, they get feedback, they see what works, what doesn't work, and they use that feedback for the next iteration, the next sprint. Yeah? So design, build, ship, design, build, ship, design, build, ship, test, learn, test, learn, test, learn. Out of that, you come a much stronger product, you're much closer to your customers, and much closer to the needs of your market. Yeah? So that, I think, is a really interesting way of working. So why don't we work like that, more like that, in communications? Some very big businesses are now working in this way. So Netflix work in this way. So they test and learn all the time. They put stuff out there, see if it works, and they apply the learnings that they get from that test. So these kinds of iterative approaches mean that you're not necessarily, you might now and then create a big, crafted, big piece, nothing wrong with that, but alongside that, you're creating smart combinations of lots of small stuff. Yeah? You're iterating along the way. That's how Agile work. So Zynga. Zynga is the Facebook gaming company that produce Farmville, Cityville, Mafia Wars, a lot of big games, about 6 out of 10 top Facebook games. Really interesting business. They are completely agile in approach. They do testing, they call it ghetto testing. Yeah, so the idea is that they do hundreds of concurrent tests to very small groups of users to see what works, and then they scale it. Yeah? So it might be they've got a 5-word description of something, they see the heat around it, whether people like it, they build a working prototype, they stick it out there to a small group of users, and then if people like it and if it works, then they will scale it. Yeah? So it's a really interesting way of working, I think. So not using metrics is like flying a plane in a cloud with no instruments. I like that. So making stuff hackable. Yeah? So it's not perfect, but it's better for the fact that it's not perfect, because it means people can play around with it. Yeah? There's an interesting piece of research that was done quite recently by MIT Sloan School of Management. They tracked over a 3-year period the amount of value, the amount of money that individuals, people like you and me, were spending on improving and making products, as opposed to big firms through their R&D. They found that it was more than twice as large as big companies. So individuals, people, have significant amounts of value to add to products and making products better. Okay, so number 5, always on marketing. Yeah, so this is talked about quite a lot, but this I think is quite transformational. Yeah, but it's strange that we're not really changing the way in which we work, even though this is with us right now. So we still have this approach of campaigning. Yeah, and in a sense, nothing wrong with campaigning down there, but this idea of speed bumps. So we deliver large amounts of ratings, we bombard our target audience with our messaging in large amounts, then our budget runs out and our awareness tails off, and then it's, before it gets to the bottom again, right, we've got to bombard them again with lots of messaging. Yeah, that's the campaigning approach. So now and then maybe you want to talk about that in a big way, nothing wrong with that, but alongside that I'd suggest there was other things that you can do, so continuous communication alongside campaigns, so not just campaigning. So Gareth Kay, very smart guy, who's the strategy director at Goodby Silverstein Partners, so he's a partner there in San Francisco. He wrote a series of posts recently, I recommend you go to his blog and read them, all about thinking small. So it's using this idea of, it's not necessarily just about big anymore, it's not about using mass media to reach as many people as you can with the same message, but instead about making those kind of small connections, about doing stuff that will start small but then scale. So small ideas, so lots of small ideas, build what he calls long ideas. Yeah. So this idea of starting here, small idea, small idea, small idea, combinations of lots of different ideas, an unravelling stream of iterations and interactions that invite people into the process as you go. Yes. That's a concept that I think is really interesting and one which I think is inherently agile in its approach. So I'm going to reference somebody else. John Wilshire just set up his own company, Smithery. So he's an innovation specialist, but he's the ex-Chief Innovation Officer for PhD. He talks about in community and social spaces how it's like bonfires and fireworks. So communities like the bonfire, you gather around that, it's nice and warm, you start talking to your neighbour, it's like nice and interactive. So it's a nice place to be, yeah? So that's what a good community is all about. But every so often you want to set up a firework, so a firework goes off and everyone goes, ooh, and ah, isn't that fantastic, it looks really good. So that might be your above the line campaign, it might be a launch, it might be some activity that you've got, but it's you kind of saying, look at what we've done, this is kind of worth taking note of. But the important thing is that some people are not at that bonfire, they might be a mile away, and they see the firework going off, and they think, that looks fun, I'm going to go to the bonfire. Yeah? So the idea is that over time, all of these pieces of activity build long-term value. Yeah? They build the community, they build people around the brand, yeah? Which I think is a very smart way of thinking about it. So I'm just going to show a couple of examples of interesting things. So what you might call take a bit of an agile approach. So Converse Domination, which is a couple of years old now, but it's an interesting campaign that Converse did using search in a really interesting way. I'm going to turn the sound up on this one because it's a bit quiet. So they used search and Google in a really interesting way, but created lots of different iterations of content along the way. So it wasn't just one idea and one piece of content, it was lots of ideas and lots of, this is the kind of classic small idea approach, I think. So this is Converse Domination.
What's the first thing you do when you go online? You go to Google. Google is the new gateway to culture, and Google Trends shows us the zeitgeist, what people care about and when. At this very moment, a teenager is typing into this little box what they're thinking, what they're looking for, questions they're too scared to ask anybody else, about moments in culture that are happening that day, people everywhere on their computers, asking a question. Any brand can buy these keywords. The more competition, the higher the price. So why are no brands buying the keywords teenagers are actually searching? This insight led us to our big idea. Be the first brand to build a campaign around low competition, low cost searches that connect us directly to our audience. So here's how it works. It's Friday and the script spelling bee is tonight. People are searching for it. We know this from the Google zeitgeist. So we buy AdWords on Google, but we do it differently. Instead of trying to sell people something, we say something conversational, something interesting, and lots of people click. And it's cheap. Now we give them the Converse take on a spelling bee.
Now this Spelling Bee works a bit different. This is the first ever search engine Spelling Bee. How it works is when I say the first word, go back to your search engine and type it into the search box. If you got it right, you'll see an ad on the right-hand side of the page for round 2. Are you ready? The first word is ludicrous.
In this case, we sent people back to use the Google search box to play the game. We turned an advertising space into a game space. We leaned into frame. This was a moment in culture, and we brought Converse into it. So we decided to make dozens of these sites, launching new ones each week, and all the sites are connected together so people can explore them. Here are some more highlights. On June 20th, all the top searches on Google have to do with summer solstice, first day of summer. But nobody's buying ads. We make an optimistic statement, perfectly suited to just this one day. For this one moment in time, we become super relevant. Teenage boys are having a self-conscious, private moment searching how to talk to a girl on Google. We enlist a girl who is clearly out of your league to provide some just friendly advice.
Okay, so I would be right here. And other hot girls that I'm telling you about that I'm gonna like get you to would be
Kid learns a
here.
lesson, everybody's happy. And we know teenagers are searching how to kiss. We created something to help them chill out. So what we created here is the first ever pure branding campaign using Google AdWords. A media buy that isn't really a media buy. It's a way to tie Converse directly to consumer interest, one-to-one. And we only pay for interested visitors. The result is a platform that lets us truly disrupt, to be hyper-relevant, to simply be there for our audience during cultural moments. And it all works as one big path leading back to Converse.com. It's been so successful that we're not stopping. As long as things are happening in culture, Converse will be there with a domination website.